how did REST come to mean the opposite of REST? So I just going through the HTMX website, and the when I opened the docs or articles, this is the first thing that kind of caught my eye, and I just wanted to explore HTMX because I've been hearing a lot about it, but I think it's like the problem that they're trying to solve is a good problem, and so I wanted to give it a try, and I came across this, and I just wanted to get it out there. What does this mean to whoever is seeing this video, I think, and maybe drop one or two opinions on the side. But yeah, so let's get started. So I am getting frustrated by the number of people calling any HTTP based interface the REST API. Today's example of social side REST API, this is RPC. It screams RPC. There is so much coupling on display that it should be given an X rating. What needs to be done next is to make understand the REST architectural style and clear on the notion of the hypertext. That hypertext is a constraint. In other words, if the engine of the application state and hence the API is not being driven by hypertext, then it cannot be RESTful and cannot be REST API. Period. That's what. So when I think this happened after the post React era, when the concept of JavaScript, highly JavaScript driven front end, and the separation of the client server thing came in mostly. After that duration, the adoption of JSON was huge. Since it was kind of driven by the merge stack trend that came in, I suppose, because during that period only React came in, and React introduced this thing called JSX, which is based on JSON, and then the backends also started kind of making it the standard way of sending responses from their backend. So people had to adopt, right? And the tools had to adopt so that they can kind of take over the trend that was going on and keep up with it. So they had to support JSON. But before that, I think the format that was mostly used was XML. I think if you have seen a lot of old APIs of maybe some legacy APIs of very old organizations around 2007, 8-ish kind of thing, then you will find maybe they are still, most of them will still be using XML because they built it on top of XML back then, and it's legacy, so no one touches it. Since it's working, that's all. So even a lot of organizations, when they consume data from somewhere else, they request it in XML format because of that. So I mean, JSON is not fundamental, it's a very recent phenomena. So, and yeah, I mean, this makes sense. The REST API term is very associated with it all the time. When we hear REST API, we mean the first thing that comes to mind is some endpoint that returns JSON response. So it kind of got fit in there by default itself because of the trend that has been going on around it. So like they are mentioning, it's being used in a wrong manner, right? So yeah, REST must be the most broadly, if I can read properly, REST must be the most broadly misused technical term in computer programming. I can't think of anything else that comes close. Today that someone uses the term REST, they are nearly always discussing a JSON-based API using HTTP. That's what, right? So when someone says REST API, or when you see REST API mentioned in a job description, what they are referring to is are you able to create endpoints on the server to return JSON response, of course, most of the time. So yeah, it's kind of misused everywhere. Job posting mentioning REST, yeah, the same thing I said. In this post, I'd like to give you a brief about incomplete and most wrong history of JSON and REST, and how we got to the place and REST originally constructed with RPC. Where did the term REST come from? So maybe my guess is it will go more into the origins of REST. The term REST, short for representational state transfer, came from chapter 5 of fields, desertation. Fielding was describing, I hope I didn't butcher the name, network architecture for then new World Wide Web, okay, and contrasting it with other popular network architectures, particularly RPC style network architectures. Makes sense. So it is important to understand that at the time of his writing, 2000s, there were no JSON APIs. Yeah, like I said, JSON is a very recent phenomenon. It's like it gained popularity after the like React trend came in, and kind of like it's kind of treated as default for a lot of cases, right? He was describing web as it existed at that time, with HTML exchange over HTTP as people surfed on web. This is a very funny analogy, right? So we had this trend before where HTML was being served over web. Then we moved to this whole concept of you make a request, you get JavaScript back, you make request again, you get what to render, you render those, and then we are kind of moving towards the same thing again. Like with if you are following React, so they also introduce server components to kind of like directly do these things on the server as well, and many things that were kind of I won't say unnecessary, but like it introduced a lot of complex things as well. Like if you are aware of what hydration means, like the hydration is kind of based on this whole back and forth or like among the client server thing as well, right? If you were to do this simply, then it won't be there. But then again, it also has its own limitations. Like let's say you don't have the unified way of doing this. There needs to be an environment around it. If you are connecting the same backend to, let's say, mobile application, let's say web application, and something else as well, everyone needs to talk in a unified language. So JSON was that. But even if we have this trend now, I hope it my assumption is maybe it will translate to those aspects as well eventually, since it has begun and people are kind of trying to, like, there's this curve that always comes up, right? So when you start at the bottom, very simple, then you complicate things up and you build a lot of things, then you are able to see like what outcome that we are able to generate and what are the problems that outcome has created. So yeah, outcomes are there, of course, but we also see the problems. And then we again move down to the simple, like this bell curve thing, right? You see this meme everywhere. So we realize the problems and we again move down back to simplicity. So that's what is coming to my mind here, and it's kind of impressive, not gonna lie. REST describes the network architecture, and it is often defined in terms of constraints on API, constraints that needed to be met in order to consider the RESTful API. Okay, the language is academic, which has contributed to the confusion around the topic, but it is clear enough that most developers should be able to understand it. The crux of REST, uniform interface and hate OS. Okay, cool. REST has many constraints and concepts within it, but there is one crucial idea that I believe is defining and the most distinguishing characteristic of REST. When contrasted with other possible known architectures, this is known as uniform interface constraint. Okay. So basically, I think it will go through like what are the requirements for something to be called REST, and maybe my case is it will prove the JSON thing wrong somehow. Could be, let's see. And more specifically, within that concept, the idea of hypermedia as an engine application, HTMX. Okay, that's what HTMX means. Or as Fielding prefers to call it, the hypermedia constraint. In order to understand this uniform interface constraint, let's consider two HTTP responses returning information from a bank account. The first is HTML and the second is JSON, right? So HTML response, we have HTML body, we have this server-side rendered data based on, these data is rendered on server-side itself. You don't have to like imagine this being called on client side. So this is the JSON response. You get this and you get this, and you have to separately render them. First you get the JavaScript to which will have the logic to get this data, like where to get this data from, how to get this data. Then you get the data, then you render. So this is the JSON case in which this will happen. But in HTML response, it's like the first request, and in the response you get this. So yeah, I think that's what it is saying. So basically it avoids this back and forth kind of thing that you have to do when you are using JSON, right? So yeah, the crucial difference here between two responses is why the HTML response is RESTful but the JSON response is not. HTML response is entirely self-describing. Yeah, this is interesting because it gives you everything, right? It gives you context of everything, whatever you have. Your client can be literally like a dumb client, and it will still be able to handle this very well, which makes sense, right? A proper hypermedia client that receives this response does not know does not know what a bank account is, what bank balance is, simply knows to render hypermedia HTML. True. That's really true. Like, that's a good take. So basically, here the client has to know how to process this kind of data. First of all, it has to know where to get this data from. Then it has to know how to render this kind of data. Here it does, like, just get the data and fucking put it on the screen, right? Just render it. That's what. This is nice. The client knows nothing about the API and endpoints associated with this data except URLs and hypermedia controls like links and forms. Discoverable within the HTML itself. If the state of the resource changes, such as the allowable actions available on the resource change, for example, if the account goes to an overdraft, then the HTML response will change to show the new actions available. This is nice. Yeah. So like if you see this response, so based on the response, you need to handle all the states on the client side. So that's kind of an overkill, right? So like it's like, let's say I don't know, maybe an account can have 10-12 states. So you have to have the code to handle all 10-12 states on the client side, when you can just render it based on whatever you have. Not render, when you can just send it in the response itself. Like the backend has to handle the business logic to determine what state the UI is in, and the UI also has to know that, okay, if this state comes, I need to show this. If this state comes, I need to show this, which kind of leads to a lot of unused code. Yeah, that's right. That makes sense. Hypertext, HTML response. Where was I? Allowable actions available, resource change, overdraft. The client would render this new HTML totally unaware of what overdraft meant. Yeah, that's what. The client can be literally dumb and just a rendering machine, and it can render whatever we sent. That's what. The server can do all the business logic once and send whatever to render once, right? It is in the manner that hypertext is the engine of application state. The HTML response carries along all the API information necessary to continue interacting with the system directly within itself. Yeah, makes sense. Now contrast that with the new JSON response. In this case, the message is not self-describing. Rather, the client must know how to interpret the status. Yeah, basically the client needs to be more smart than basically the client needs to be smarter here to process what this means, and that also means it has to know a lot of things. That also means you need a lot of code on client side. Further, the client must know what actions are available on the account based on the out of the band information, that is the information of URLs, parameters, and so forth derived from account source information outside of the response, such as Swagger API documentation. Okay, got it. So basically, like how to handle those responses, how to show the data, how to do this, how to do that. That is there, and also the state is there. Like what state should we show based on the data? So it needs to know that as well. The JSON response is not self-describing and does not encode the state of the resource within hypermedia. It therefore fails the uniform interface constraint of REST, and thus it's not RESTful. Makes sense. So JSON is just a part of the whole equation, right? It's not the whole equation. The point of REST here is it should be the whole equation. If I understood what the article is saying, the point of REST is it should be the whole equation. It should have everything. It does not have everything. It just has the data, but you still need something to know where can you get the data from, and then like know what account number is, know where to show it, and this and that. So this is not the full picture. So yeah, I think that makes sense. So it's not self-describing, and it does not encode the state of the resource. I already went through it. Inventor. The RESTful APIs must be hypermedia driven. Fielding goes and says a REST API should be entered with no prior knowledge beyond the initial URL. Set of standardized media types that are appropriate for the internet audience. From the point at all application state transitions must be driven by client selection of server provided choices that are present in received representations or implied by users manipulation of those representations. So yeah, this is I think a lot of words, but it's very simple to understand because like it's saying the choices should be server provided. So this is a very important thing. Choices should be server provided, as in every decision should be made in the server on what to show the client. So what you show the client are the choices you provide to the client, whatever actions they can make. So basically, in most JavaScript based framework or React based applications, this is on the client side, as we have been discussing about. The server just sends the data and the client like decides what to show, what not to show based on the data. So you have to hold all the possible states on the client side as well. And again, the client side routing and all those things, those also the client need to know, right? So the client needs to know a lot of things here. So like, I mean, this can be good approach for a lot of client driven applications. I don't know, but yeah, this makes sense. Like the thing that you're talking about, it's if it's RESTful or if it's not. So that doesn't matter here. So in the RESTful system, you should be able to enter the system through a single URL, and from that point on, all navigation action should be entirely provided through self-describing hypermedia through links and forms in HTML, for example. Beyond the entry point in a proper RESTful system, the API client should not need any additional information about the API. Basically, a dumb client. Dumb client, do everything, return them to client. Client renders. It also like actions and everything are determined in the server itself. The client should just render. That's all. This is the source of incredible flexibility of the RESTful system. Since all the responses are self-describing and encode all the currently available actions available, there is no need to worry about it. For example, versioning your API. In fact, you don't need to document it. If things change, the hypermedia responses change. That's it. Yeah. If the client is dumb, you don't have to make multiple changes. When you make a change on a server, you don't have to make the change on the client side on how to handle it and like remove it and so on, whatever, right? It's an incredibly flexible and innovative concept for building distributed systems. I should give it a thought maybe, but yeah, let's move on. Industry, lol, no RESTful APIs or JSON. Today, most web developers are, and most companies would call this second example RESTful API. Yeah, that's true. We discussed like the job descriptions and so on. When someone says RESTful APIs, they mean like most of the time they mean are you able to create endpoints to return JSON. They probably wouldn't even regard the first response as an API response. It's just HTML, port HTML. APIs are always JSON, maybe if you fancy something like protobuf, right? This is a different concept. We'll talk about it later. So it's like another alternative encoding mechanism which kind of solves some problems with JSON for data serving and all. Wrong. You are wrong and you should feel bad. Okay. The first response is an API response, and in fact, the one call is RESTful. The second response, in fact, is a remote procedural call. RPC, style of an API. The client and the server are coupled, just like social side API fielding complaint about back into Sunday. The client needs to have additional knowledge about the resource it's working with. Must be derived from some other source beyond the JSON response itself. Yeah, so this is the same thing that we've been talking about, right? So when you're working with something like this, so you first have to go fetch the JavaScript, and you load the JavaScript, and then you have to call the APIs, and then you get the data, and then the client has to know how to show the data and the conditions and all on what to show and what not to show, and then based on those you have to again render the UI. So it's this back and forth thing, right? The client needs to do a lot of things, the client needs to know a lot of things. So it's also kind of good in stages where, let's say, the applications are kind of client heavy, so you are kind of offloading a lot of responsibilities on the client side and doing it on the server as well. So yeah, I mean, it could be useful for some use cases maybe, but then again, it's not REST. And so how REST came to mean restless? Now how on the did we get the spot where APIs are obviously not RESTful, called RESTful by 99% of the industry? Yeah, so REST has kind of become like this buzzword that people use without knowing what it means, right? So it's kind of funny. Yeah. So Roy Fielding published this discussion in 2009. Around the same time, XML RPC and explicitly used RPC inspired protocol was released and started gathering steam as a method to build APIs in HTTP. XML RPC was a part of a larger project called SOAP. Microsoft built XML RPC came out of a long tradition of RPC style protocols. mainly from enterprises world, with a lot of static typing and early XML maximization shown as well. Also arrived in this time was AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Note well the XML here. AJAX, as everyone knows, allows browser to issue HTTP requests to the server in the background and process the response directly in JavaScript, opening the whole new world of programming for web. Yeah, so this is the thing that we've been talking about, right? So AJAX kind of took some responsibilities that that should have been done by the server for HTML, like so it kind of use JavaScript and all to make HTTP calls. The concept of like returning the client server communication thing, right? So your client knows where to call, what to call, it calls them, it gets the JSON, it gets the XML, and it parses them and checks the conditions and renders and that concept, right? So basically allows browser to issue the HTTP request to server in the background and process the response directly in JavaScript. So this whole thing, this was a game changer for some. The question was, what should those requests look like? They were obviously going to be XML. It's right there in the name. And the new SOAP XML RPC standard was out, maybe. That was the right thing. Maybe REST can work for web services. Some people noticed that the web first has different sort of architecture that Fileting has described, and began to ask if REST other than SOAP should be the preferred mechanism for accessing what were coming to be called web services. The web was also proving to be extremely flexible and growing gangbusters. So maybe the same network architecture, REST, that was working so well for browsers and humans could also work well for APIs. So let's see, the REST wasn't very relevant with the API thing. This concept of web services kind of was an approach to see how we can have that school of thought implemented in our web services or our APIs and so on, right? It sounded plausible, especially when XML was the format for APIs. XML sure looks an awful lot like HTML, doesn't it? You can imagine XML API satisfying all the RESTful constraints up to and including the uniform interface. So people began exploring that out as well. While all things were happening, another important technology was in process of being born. Yeah, makes sense, right? The XML was, like I said, kind of similar to what looked like HTML, and it had all the things like the hypermedia context of REST API that we've been talking about, right? JSON was literally JavaScript to SOAP XML RPCs. JavaScript to SOAP XML RPCs, Java, simple, dynamic and easy. It's hard to believe now that JSON is dominant format in most web APIs, but it actually took a while for JSON to catch on. As late 2008, discussions around API development were mainly around XML, not JSON. Yeah, that's what I said. Like the legacy companies and all, they still use XML in a lot of old APIs that they're running. If you go for very old software like banking softwares and stuff, so you'd probably still see a lot of XML there. Formalizing REST APIs in 2008, Martin Flower published an article popularizing the Richardson maturity model, a model for determine how RESTful API was given. This model proposed 4 levels, with the level of being plain old XML or the swamp of POCs. Swamp of POC, resources, reverbs, hypermedia controls. My assumption is, yep. So it has 3 levels. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but let's go through it. From here, an API could be considered more mature as a REST API as it adopted the following class. Level 1, resources. Example, resource have a URL layout, contrasted with an opaque URL layout as the XML RPC. Level 2, HTTP verbs using get, post, delete, etc. properly. Level 3, hypermedia controls like links. Okay, cool. Level 3 is where the uniform interface comes in, which is why this level is considered to be the most mature and truly the glory of the REST. Damn. REST wins, kind of. So unfortunately for that term REST, 2 things happen at this time. Everyone switched to JSON. Everyone stopped at level 2 of RMM. This makes sense. So when you have JSON, you kind of lose out on hypermedia control, since you are just focusing more on the data transfer aspect of it. So when you do that, you remove a lot of those like it removes a lot of constraint, but that removal of constraint is what made it REST in the first place. So the focus kind of stayed till here, and yeah, understandable. Like it didn't. This thing was kind of ignored while this thing was like the evolution of JSON was happening as a standard. JSON rapidly took over the web service API world because of SOAP XML RPC and was dramatically over-engineered. JSON was simple, just worked, and was easy to read and understand. With the change, the web development world threw off all the shackles into the J2EE mindset conclusively regarding SOAP XML RPC to be the enterprise-only affair. The legacy companies. Since the REST approach wasn't as tied to XML as SOAP RPC was, and since it did not impose as much formality on endpoints, REST was the natural place for JSON to take over, and it did it so rapidly. During the crucial change, something became increasingly clear that most JSON APIs were stopping at level 2 of RMM. Yep, as we discussed, makes sense. Some pushed through to level 3, incorporating hypermedia controls in their responses, but clearly all these APIs still needed to publish documentation indicating the glory of REST was not being achieved. Yeah, I mean, even if you push hypermedia controls, if the client side needs to know what to do with them, and if it's not very clear from the REST thing itself, it's not REST. So you have to publish different documentation on how to handle this, how to handle that, and so on. So yeah, makes sense. JSON taking over the response format should have been a strong hint as well. JSON is obviously not hypertext. You can impose hypermedia controls on top of it, but it isn't natural. True. XML at least looked like a stable kind of, but so it's so it was plausible that you could create hypermedia with it. JSON was just data. Yeah, it's just a like huge blob of data that you pass here and there, and everyone needs to know what to do with it. JSON is dumb basically. So we made the data dumb, we made the client smarter. So that's kind of a trade-off that we are facing here. When like with XML or with HTML, the data can be smarter so that the client can be dumb. So yeah, maybe that's an oversimplification, but let's see. Adding hypermedia controls was awkward, non-standardized, and rarely used in deeper manner described by the uniform interface constraint. Despite these difficulties, the term REST stuck. The REST was just the opposite of SOAP. JSON APIs were in SOAP, therefore JSON APIs were REST. This derivation, man. Despite these difficulties, the term REST stuck. REST was the opposite of SOAP. JSON APIs were in SOAP. Therefore, God damn it. There's just one sentence version of how we got here. I kind of agree with this. Good one. The rest was, despite the JSON API, despite the JSON API world never consistently achieving truly RESTful APIs, there are plenty of fights over whether or not RESTless APIs being created were RESTful. Arguments over URL layouts, over which HTTP verb was appropriate for given action, flame wars about media types, and back and forth. I was young at the same time, and the whole thing struck me as an opaque brute, and I don't know what, too lazy to read this, and alienating. So yeah, I got the point. So I pretty much gave up on the whole idea of REST, and it was something condescending people fought over the internet. What I really saw mentioned or I did was the concept of uniform interface. Yeah, that makes sense. So like as we made the data dumb and as we made the client smarter, this unified thing kind of got lost. So basically, in very oversimplified terms, in REST APIs, the concept for the concept of REST to prevail, the data needs to be smarter than the client. But we kind of moved away from that norm when we started adopting JSON. So we started delegating the what would have been a responsibility of data in REST to the client side, and we kind of moved that responsibility to the client, but we still called it REST, which didn't make sense. But this makes sense. Yeah, true. So and then when I began boring news, this for later. Let's see the state of REST today. Eventually, most people got tired trying to add hypermedia controls to JSON APIs. Yeah, this makes sense because like if something is getting popularized, tools will be built around it. So when you build tools around something there you cannot build tools around some other thing. If that makes sense. So tooling is kind of an important factor here as well, and the marketing that happened during that duration of JSON by the several things that came out during that time, including React, and they kind of popularized this notion and everything. Like it created this whole ecosystem of things which suddenly became dependent on JSON for everything, and also kind of incentivized people to build things around JSON, right? So that it will be adopted very easily, since like to write the single page application in React way, people started adopting like building things around JSON. So, and that's like a never-ending cycle that keep on, like it's like a self-feeding cycle that kept on feeding itself, right? So it kept on going up and up, and so kind of like a chain reaction. Things settled into immediate restless state with REST slowly cementing its meaning the JSON API at level 1, level 2 of RMM, but there was always possibility that we could break through level 3 and the glory of REST. Then single page applications hit, the drama starts. When SPAs hit, web development become disconnected entirely from the original underlying RESTful architecture. The entire networking architecture of SPA application moved over to JSON RPC style. Additionally, due to the complexity of these applications, developers specialize into front-end and back-end. Yeah. So if the data is not smart, the client needs to be smarter or the server needs to be smarter in both cases. So that created two separate aspects, the front end and the back end. So that also gave birth to this trend of front end and back end developers. Front end developers were obviously not doing anything RESTful. They were working with JavaScript, building DOM object, calling AJAX APIs when needed. This was much more like thick client authoring than anything like the early web. Yeah, this is kind of different from that, which makes sense because you're delegating the responsibility of data to clients. So someone has to build the client. Someone has to build a smarter client to know how to handle these things. The backend engineers were still concerned with the network architecture to an extent, and like you can literally see it, right? So it started as this unified thing, and I don't know, like it started as this unified thing, and there was some confusion in the middle, and it suddenly got split into two things. Like the whole journey of it is very weird, right? So funny. So the backend engineer is still concerned with the network architecture to an extent, and they continue to use the term REST to describe what they were doing. Even though they were doing things like publishing Swagger documentation for the RESTful APIs. Which, like now this sentence sounds so ironic, right? So you need documentation for something RESTful, which is or complaining about the churn of maybe there's some other article here. Things wouldn't be occurring if they were actually creating RESTful APIs. Finally, in the late 2010s, people had enough. REST even in its restless form simply wasn't keeping up with the needs of increasingly complex SP applications. The applications are becoming more and more like thick client problems, and need thick client solutions, not bastardized hypermedia client solutions. Yeah, I mean, if you think of it in a different way, right? So what if you delegate a lot of responsibilities to the client side? There are some advantages. I won't say there isn't, because it's like you're getting free compute on everything, right? So that client is running it on some machine, so you can do a lot of things if you delegate something to the client side that you could have done on the server and handle those things at scale. So this is totally right. I mean, like maybe for some use cases this will be more relevant as well, and I'm not saying anything like this should not happen or anything as such, but yeah, I mean, like the complexity kind of increase that's there, but also the same general answer for everything. It depends on the use case. It depends on what you're building. So if you are building like humongous client-side interactions with a lot of client-side logics and having animations and different states and like I don't know. So you get my point. So finally, in the late 2010s, people had we went through this. GraphQL couldn't be less RESTful. You absolutely have to have documentation to understand. Yeah, this I agree with. Like I tried GraphQL. I worked on a few projects with it, and when I was starting with it, it was not that intuitive or that easy to understand. Like I understood the problem that it is trying to solve, but to wrap the head around it and how to use it to connect applications and stuff, it was not very simple. Let's just stick to that. So it offers schemas in various ways. Let's skip this part. People like GraphQL in many cases, and if you're building thick client-side application, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, true. True, because like it totally depends on a use case. There is no thing like it's the best, it's the worst, it's this, that. But like in some cases, you need this complexity. That's important. But if you make that the norm, you will end up using it in use cases where you can get away with not introducing this much of complexity as well. So that's what. The short answer to this question is that HTMX isn't a good fit for most modern use cases of APIs. That is why after almost 20 years, HTMX still hasn't gained wide adoption among developers. GraphQL, on the other hand, spread like wildfire because it solves real-world problems. True. So GraphQL isn't REST. It doesn't claim to be REST. It doesn't want to be REST. This is nice. But as of today, the vast majority of developers and companies, even when they excitedly add GraphQL functionality to their APIs, continue to use the term REST to describe what they're building. Yeah, so REST at this point is like that thing that started with something very specific, and people started taking things out from it bit by bit, and they are still calling it REST, and those bit by bit led to taking out a lot of things, and they are still calling it REST. And since it's slower, we haven't quite realized that like it's not REST anymore, dude. Like, come on. What can we do about the situation? Unfortunately, Void Funk was probably right. You can tap the sign as much as you want, but the battle was lost a long time ago. REST is just a common term people use for HTTP persistent RPC. Yeah, makes sense. So you're making an HTTP call, you're getting a JSON response, and it's a remote procedural call. So makes sense. We are going to keep calling obviously non-RESTful JSON APIs REST because that's just what everyone calls them now. Despite my increasingly vigorous sign tapping 50 years from now, Global Omnicorp is still advertising jobs for working on V138 as a RESTful JSON Swagger API documentation. Damn. I'm going to create RESTful APIs using JSON. Here are my docs. The situation is hopeless but not serious. Regardless, there is an opportunity here to explain REST, and in particular the uniform interface to a new generation of web developers who may have heard of those concepts in their original context, who assume that REST equal to JSON APIs. People sense something is wrong and maybe REST, the REST real, actual, non-RESTless could be a part of that. At the very least, the ideas behind REST are interesting, and word for name, this is a large meta point. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a change for good. Like, this is something that we can explore, that is worth exploring as of now, like bringing back the simplicity and also in the same time getting the same kind of use cases that we are able to do now without having like this bulky JavaScript that comes up with every web application by default at this point, right? So if you have noticed, we have been seeing this recent shift of things that are less JavaScripty, less JSON, and I think I have a good feeling about this. I think it's for the good. Like, I don't know. That's just my opinion on this. And yeah, I think HTMX is promising actually. The problem that it aims to solve, it's like things are getting a lot complicated than it needs to be. Like, it happens, right? So when you start with solving a problem, you create a lot of additional problems. So when you start with solving a core problem, You propose a solution that creates a lot of additional problem. You solve some of them, that creates a lot of additional problem. You solve some of them, that cycle keeps on going, right? So with every cycle, you keep on moving away from the core problem that you're solving, and it creates its own kind of things which kind of gets tangled. And every once in a while, it's just fresh to see things like this, that okay, that like pulls things to the base again. So just to remind people, okay, so this is the problem that we were trying to solve, and this is the thing that we ended up with. So yeah, I think it's a long video. I think that should be it for this video. If you like this video, drop a comment. I'd like to know your opinions on HTMX and what you think about this shift that has been going on. And if you would want me to make more of these videos, please, like, you can recommend me articles or just let me know. I'll find more of this. Okay, see you folks. Bye.